JFK, Time for the Truth, Part 2. Okay, and the government may be assumed to have other methods of keeping secrets, ones that are not official. Do you know what is going on in Iron Mountain, in the Pentagon, in Los Alamos, in Guatemala, in Langley, Virginia, in Murcia, Mexico, on every small island dotting the coast of North America? No. Taking the presidency underground would be a small concern compared to the other things the government does every day. You fake a death, put another guy in the White House as a front, Johnson, and then call in your orders on the phone. You could even hijack at Hyannis Point or Martha's Vineyard with no inconvenience to him or the family. Do you know what goes on at the Kennedy estates? Did anyone ever know anything that went on there, unless those who were there wanted them to know? No. Why exactly would it be any different to take a presidency underground? You don't know what is going on in my house or the house next door, do you? What makes you think you know or could know or would know anything about the Kennedys, unless they wanted you to know? That's basically anything. They only let you know what they want you to know. Keep that in mind. That's another thing, too. The press wasn't even bright enough to show up to film the motorcade in Dallas. That is why we have to rely on shaky hand Zeev and high shot Bell. The press wasn't bright enough to ask for evidence the president was dead. The press wasn't bright enough to see through the Oswald Act. What makes you think the press is bright or self-motivated enough to penetrate the Kennedy's secrets? Has anyone ever searched for Jack on Martha's Vineyard or elsewhere? No. There has never been any sort of investigation of that sort, even at the Kennedy's compound. Jack could still be there watching TV and eating Doritos, and no one would know the difference. You don't find things you don't look for, and no one has ever investigated the possibility that Jack continued to be president after November 22nd, 1963. Before we move on, I want to point out that this explains all the coincidences between the Lincoln assassination and the Kennedy assassination. These coincidences include name and dates, coincidence, and have been publicized for many decades. You have probably heard of them. One of them concerns Lincoln's Secretary Kennedy and Kennedy's Secretary Lincoln, for instance. Well, since I have shown both assassinations were manufactured, we now see that the coincidences weren't coincidences at all. They were parallelly, purposely inserted in both stories after the fact by the storytellers. You can also think of them as clues. They were clues planted by intelligence to test your intelligence. The storyteller wanted to fool you, yes, but they want to toy with you at the same time, since it makes them feel twice as powerful. We will see many more examples of that below, but let us return to Dallas for more clues. According to the mainstream story, security was terrible that day. Downtown Dallas was uncontrolled, and according to the alternative theories, security was even worse, allowing multiple shooters and immediate free access to the streets. I will show that this appearance that Dallas was uncontrolled is false. Remember that alternative theorists look at the open windows in the book depository and assume that means the Secret Service was not in control of the building. But then they assume later that the Secret Service was part of the conspiracy, or that a gun was planted in the depository, or that Oswald was a patsy and or was framed, and so on. In other words, they imply that the open window were not an accident or oversight. The building was not uncontrolled. It was controlled by the bad guys, whoever they were, and they were part of the government. Although I agree that the building was controlled, I make a different assumption about who was controlling it. I assume that since Kennedy was in control of their overall event, his men must have been in full control of that entire part of the city. That means that they were in full control of the crowd and all the buildings. If windows were left open, they were not left open to encourage snipers. They were left open to be conspiracy pieces in a play. To say it another way, the whole motorcade was like a Hollywood movie. Yes, they were shooting a movie that day. In fact, they were shooting several. They hired multiple amateur cameramen to film their one-day movie and host of extras. Everyone there that day, including Z Films and Bell and all the rest, were extras in the movie. In that sense, they were all conspirators. But remember, they were not conspirators to a murder, which makes it somewhat easier to understand. It made it so much easier for all these people to lie, since there was never any blood on anyone's hand that day. They were not lying about the assassination of a president. No, they were only lying about a president going underground for his own safety. They were protecting their beloved commander-in-chief. We already have extensive proof that many of these people were insiders. Zapruder Z-Film is the best example. Somehow he managed to bump into the Secret Service within moments of the shooting, and the film from his camera was taken by them to be developed. This is known, and yet it is not interpreted. As Sherlock would have said, it is seen but not observed. The Z-Film was an extra that day, probably is paid extra, therefore nothing he did that day was an accident. It was all scriptured. If he was too far away for a positive ID, that was no accident. If he had a companion to corroborate his story, that was no accident. If he ran into the Secret Services soon after the shooting, that was not serendipity. That was the plan. Same thing with Bell. Why were both these cameramen shooting from 100 yards away in Daley Plaza when we know people were snapping pictures from the curbside? It is not that Zapruder or Bell got there late. Zapruder tells us that he walked back to stand on the wall. But why would he do that? The crowds were so sparse in Daley Plaza that he didn't have to shoot over anyone. He could have shot right, or took the pictures right up next to the street. So that's another red flag right there. Zapruder is supposed to be shooting from that white wall back there, but no one is in front of him. Why not shoot from the curbside? And besides, people were stepping out in the street to take pictures, as we know from the pictures themselves. We can see from Zapruder and Bell's own film that there were no ropes and no police present to keep picture takers on the grass or at a safe distance. Zapruder had no need to back up 100 yards. We must assume he did it for a reason. And the best assumption to make is that he did it under orders. From the curbside, he might have filmed something important. From back on the white wall, his film was useless except as propaganda. By the same token, the window and the book depository were just part of the script, part of the movie that was being shot. They were open to cue the audience to make it easier for the viewers to figure the position of the villain. More evidence in support of this is found by looking at the crowd in Daley Plaza. This crowd has been studied in detail, but the big question has not ever been asked. That question is, why so few people? You have blue skies and lots of green grass. This is the only open space, the only park-like area along the route. This would be the best place to camp out, waiting for the motorcade. We see no ropes, almost no police. The public appears to be welcome. We are given no indication that the public was kept away, since if they had been, these day-tripping Dallasites we do see would not be there either. No, we are to believe that the public was welcome, but only showed up in twos and threes. Kennedy was the most popular president since Teddy Roosevelt, and yet Dallas decided to stay home. You might think that few knew of the motorcade, but the Dallas Morning Star had published a map of the route that morning. Both Dallas papers had published the route on the 19th, 3 days earlier, so people had time to make picnic plans and whatnot. You would expect that everyone who worked downtown would be taking a coffee break to run downstairs. Those who did not work downtown and did not need to be able to scoot back up to the office afterwards would naturally be drawn to the grassy open plaza where the biggest crowd could gather. The slopes would allow even latecomers to see over those in front of them. As you can see from the stairs leading up to the grassy knolls, a knoll is a hill, and yet we see only a single broken line of watchers downtown in nearly empty Daley Plaza. For clear proof of this, see the Maria Munchmore video shot from the opposite side of the Zapruder. Where is everybody? Why are there just a scattering of people here? Where the best grass is and most open space? This makes no sense if you accept the standard theory. And the alternative theory makes no effort to explain it either. According to them, it's just a coincidence or an accident. It is beyond explanation. But in the real story, it is easily explained. This area was not open to the public. It only appeared to be open to the public. Actually, everyone there had been staged and scripted. They were told what to say afterwards or told to say nothing. And that is why you see so few people. The assistant director of the movie had every reason to limit the number of extra hires. Since every extra was a potential risk, they might blab later. This is the obvious explanation for why the crowds were only one deep in the first part of the motorcade and why they are almost non-existent in Dealey Plaza. All the extras further back in the route can be lied to. They can be treated almost like the ignorant public. Only the extras actually in Dealey Plaza have to be told larger parts of the story, and so the assistant directors would naturally want to limit their numbers as much as possible. You have just enough extras there to act as fake witnesses and cameramen, but no more. That is the explanation for the spareness of the crowd in the best part of the route. You can see that it makes much more sense to assume that Kennedy was in complete control of Dallas that day than to assume that he was absurdly out of control of everything. What we saw was motorcade that didn't make sense. It seemed to be absurdly out of control. Both the standard story and the alternative stories make no sense of it. They push the story in the direction of every greater amount of chaos. The standard story wants us to believe that Kennedy would ride through a major city with the crowds and buildings uncontrolled. We have people purposely allowed to stand on the curb without ropes or police, and we have buildings with open windows and so on. Makes no sense. The alternative theory corrects this theory not by pushing it towards sensibility or control, but by pushing it into greater levels of chaos. Instead of one shooter in one location, we have multiple shooters in multiple locations. We have people carrying guns in the area of the motorcade from all points on the compass, and not just handguns but rifles, which are not so easy to conceal. We have the Secret Service being pulled from the car. We have breakdowns in every direction, all unnoticed by Kennedy. In fact, to accept the alternative theories, we have to assume that their hero, Kennedy, was an absolute idiot. According to the alternate theories, we have a city in such a state of chaos that only a tranquilized mannequin could fail to sense it. But rather than push the scene in that direction, it makes much more sense to push it in the other direction. If we see apparent chaos, it is more sensible to assume that this chaos is fake. For instance, if we see the Secret Services being pulled off the car, we must assume that Kennedy can feel the weight being lost from the rear end. He is near the back of the car. Two grown men climbing off the car is not going to pass unknown to Kennedy. Therefore, we must assume that he knew about it. You can notice in the film he didn't look back and order them back on. So we may assume that he is the one who ordered them off. If they make elaborate gesture protest about it to their superior officer, we must assume that these protests are scripted. In fact, they look scripted. In The Men Who Killed Kennedy, we see the agent shrugging 3 times, each time more obvious than the last. We are told by the narrative, yes, and why is that? Do you think the agent was drawing attention to himself? Is that what agents are taught to do? If they're about to murder the president, do you suppose they squabble in public about it with huge gestures? No. It was part of the play. Just like the open window, Kennedy is about to fake his own death, so he has to clear the way for the fake bullet. He knows the bullet is supposed to come from the open window, and he doesn't want anyone to ask questions later about the line of sight of Oswald. But pulling the agents off the car must seem strange, so Kennedy makes it part of the script. The agent is told to ham it up, as if he is asking the guy in the following car, why is this happening? It can't be thought that Kennedy ordered them off, since that would be even more suspicious than the superior officer ordering them off. So the Secret Service plays its little part and allows itself to look like part of the conspiracy. They knew they could never be prosecuted for a fake death, so what was a little acting? It was all part of the job. They were in fact protecting their president, as you now see. But was there a body double in Dealey Plaza or not? I will be asked. I spent a page setting that argument up, but if the whole thing was a stage play, then there doesn't appear to be any need for a double body. Yes, earlier I thought open the possibility that a stunt double was used in the second part of the route, and even left open the possibility that the stunt double was killed. But an actual murder in Dealey Plaza is not a necessary part of the plot of this movie. No, real shots were fired. That would risk losing a bullet in the grass to be found later. Better to fire blanks and then plant all the bullets and damage later, right where you need it. You have control of the car afterwards, so you can fire any bullets you want into later. Plus, you have the film. If you don't want to shut down Dealey Plaza again in the future in order to fix any gaps that show up later, you have the film you can retouch. In fact, that was the whole point of the film. You not only have a record to stand as proof to the public, you have a correctable record. The real conspirators are still correcting the Z film, as we can see from the internet to this day. Most of the copies of the Z film posted on the web have been pushed in some way, either by cutting the beginning or end, by running only in slow-mo, by clipping the edge, or by stabilizing. That conveniently purges this anomaly, or that no one was killed. There was a body double in Dealey Plaza. I used the body double argument earlier mainly in order to show there was no proof of a murder. The simple idea of a body double combined with the lack of film continuously meant that we had no evidence that would hold up in court that anyone was murdered that day. But it is clear that Kennedy was not in Dealey Plaza at all, for several reasons. One, Zapruder and Bell and Daniels all shot from far away or panned away at the crucial moments. More men shot from behind. If Kennedy were actually there, we would have no reason to keep the film at a distance. 2. Whatever happened to the Kennedy devil, whether it was film fakery and heavy acting or a tomato or something else, was probably not pleasant. If we assume that we are seeing more than crude special effects at the critical hit, then even the least nastiest thing, the tomato, would still be something Kennedy would want to avoid. Getting hit in the eye with a tomato is not a lot of fun, and it could cause injury. 3. Once you start having blanks fired and deaths faked, you are in a touchy situation, no matter how in control of the scene you are. All it would have taken is one traitor substituting a real bullet for a blank, and your fake death becomes a real one. Yes, you would immediately have your man, but some traitors give their lives for a cause. It would be too risky for Kennedy to be in the car during the critical scenes in the movie. At some point late in the route, the switch was made, although of course I can't say precisely how. If all the spectators were extras, it makes it a lot easier to explain since no one has to be fooled. It is more likely, however, that most of them were fooled somehow. The more of them you fool, the fewer of them you have to pay or threaten or convince. A possibility may be given by two famous photos by Altogens. We have the photo from behind taken by Allergen on Houston Street, which I have already mentioned. And then we have a photo taken in front by Alice Jen on Elm, just after the fatal hit. In passing, I will mention that in neither photo can we identify the passengers, which is convenient. But that is not my point here. My point is that Altgens must have had superhuman speed to outrun the car between Houston and Elm. Some would look to the route and say that he cut across the triangle, but that does not wash since there was a building in the way. While the motorcade was going around the corner, he would have had to either to follow it around the corner, running into the crowd, or to run backwards around the building across the plaza, beating the car to the point of the second photo. I find it difficult to believe that he could have done that. I find it even more difficult to believe that he would have gone to the trouble to do that, only to get into the second position and take another photo of no one. Why would anyone take a photo of the back of the president's head, then go, oh darn, sprint ahead, making sure to outrun the car, and then take a photo of the front windshield with no one important in the frame? Two other scenarios are much more likely, given the evidence. Either both shots were set up for Altgens by the assistant directors, making sure that nothing of importance was visible, or the motorcade stopped at some point between the two photos, allowing Altgens time to get ahead. The motorcade would have no reason to stop for traffic at the intersection of Houston and Elm, so possibly they stopped to switch the real Kennedy for the fake one. The second Altgens photo just above also stands as proof of one of my other contentions, that being that people were stepping into the street to take photos, the angle of this photo makes it clear that Aldrich was right in the middle of the street, not too very far in front of the motorcycle cops. This is extraordinary in itself. It suggests that all normal rules of conduct were out the window that day, and it suggests that these amateur cameramen and photographers were not amateur at all. They were paid to do what they were doing. They were paid to do it poorly, and they were allowed extraordinary access to do it. Let's look closer at this shot of Aldrin in these enlargements. We can see that Conley is looking to his right, but as I said, we cannot identify Kennedy. He is behind the rear view mirror and is said to be clutching his throat. In the further blow up, we see several more problems. Yes, we see a large hand up, but we cannot see what it is clutching or if it is clutching anything. We can see for sure that his arm is being held by a white glove, which we assume is Jacqueline's hand, but it appears to me he is ducking, not clutching his throat. His head is under the hand. Why? Because the top half of the head we see does not belong to the man with the hand up. It is too small. Look first at how big the hand is compared to the head. Then compare that head to the head of the front seat passenger. Then compare that small head to the head of the men in the following car. That head is smaller than the head in the following car. That is the head of someone kneeling behind the car. Also, it doesn't look like Kennedy anyways. If Kennedy is in the car, he's ducking behind Conley, not clutching his throat. Well, if he is ducking, he must be in danger, right? Maybe not from gunshots. Mike Rivero has asked why the man in the falling car in the middle behind the rearview mirror is smiling. See green line. He sees this man as a conspirator, but a better question is why all the people in the crowd are continuing to smile and clap. Notice on the far right, someone is in the middle of a clap, and on the far left, all the people are continuing to smile and look forward. Would they do that if shots had just rung out? If 3 shots had just rung out, the car would have screeched to a stop, the motorist cops would have been their feet on the pavement, and the Secret Service would be jumping toward the car. People would be screaming in horror or have their mouths open or would be falling to the ground. And we see none of this. Here are some pictures of what we were talking about above. As you can see, the first one totally blurred. And then you have the one where you just notice all the people are like so close to them. And we know how presidents work. I mean, if you would have seen them anywhere else before this event, you're not going to notice people getting to be that close to especially our president. So these are just some pictures for you to look at and think about. Pause your video and take as long as you need to. Whether staged or not, this is not a picture of shots ringing out. If I knew nothing of history and were studying this photograph as a forensic expert, I would say that the man behind the car has just jumped into the street behind Kennedy. Jacqueline had warned him, and he had ducked his head under his arm as a precaution. Conley and the 2 Secret Servicemen have turned to monitor the minor threat, as has the policeman to the left. The crowd to the left also seems to be looking in that direction, but since they are smiling, I assume the man behind the car is just clowning or running into the street to grab a mentor or something. People are smiling or responding to a low-grade threat because that is what is happening. I see no sign of either shot or intrigue. Beyond that, I ask again, why no one sees Alt Jones as a threat to the motorcade, although he is obviously standing in the middle of the street to take this picture. Are the motorcycle cops just going to drive around him and pat him on the back as they pass? An even better question is why we are told this is the point of the 3 shots when it clearly is too early. There are still buildings to the left. We haven't even gotten to the sign, much less to the Z-film sequence point. Just look at the curve of the street. The motorcade is still in the turn. Oswald wouldn't have had to shot through the tree from there. Another thing to notice is the shadowed face of the front seat passenger. Why can't we see his face? We can see his face in other photos, so it is not to prevent his identification that day. I would suggest it's to prevent our noticing that he is not the same guy as in other pictures of that day. As you will see in a moment, several takes were shot, perhaps even on separate days, and we have many continuing problems. It may be that they didn't even remember to get the right guy in the right role there and had to shadow him out in the lab later. Finally, notice the people hanging out the window in the second enlargement. Is that evidence of a route that has been properly secured? No, this isn't real presidential motorcade. This is some sort of Hollywood production, poorly managed for continuing and believability. Here are 2 other pieces of photo evidence supporting my theory. The first photo was last published by ABC in November 2007 with the caption, "The presidential motorcar through Dallas a few moments before John F. Kennedy's 35th president of the United States was shot." The author of the accompanying story was Chuck Goody of WLS-TV. Do you notice anything odd here? Conley is in the back seat with Jack, where Jackie is normally seen. In addition, he is wearing a gray suit. In other photos that day, he is wearing a black suit. In the other photos, his hair is parted on the left side. Here it is brushed back. And look at the 2 ladies, whoever they are. Remember that Jackie is wearing a large 2-tiered pink hat that day, which would appear white in this photo. Here are the 2 pictures that we were talking about. In this picture, you see that Conley's in the back seat with him. And then in this picture, we see that Jackie is in the back seat. So take the time to study that. And then he's wearing a different colored suit in them as well. But neither of these ladies has on a whitish hat. It is highly doubtful that Jackie would have taken off that hat in an open car, since like all ladies then and now, she would not want her hair messed up. It is almost certain that the hat would have been pinned on. She had it on earlier in the route, and she had it on the Z filmed. Why is she in the front seat here with no hat? We must assume that it is supposed to be her on the far side, not the near, since the near side seat was always occupied by Mrs. Conley. Further proof of that can be seen by looking at their collars. Jackie had a wide black collar on her pink dress. The near side lady has an upturned collar, the same color as her dress. It would appear that this movie was shot in several different forms and that we have some continually issues here. Later editors would not very carefully, and photos have survived, amazingly still used as propaganda that should have been destroyed. It is even possible that these bad photos are published on purpose to test the continued stupidity of the American public. I can just hear the Kennedys, wherever they are, laughing it up, saying we could put a gorilla in a pink hat and a polka dot brazier in the back seat with Jackie and no one would ever notice. Do you still think these people could recognize the difference between Jack and a body double when they can't even tell the difference between Jacqueline and John Conley? We see a similar problem in this photo. The photo fakery got Conley in the wrong spot again. Notice that Jackie is also wearing the wrong thing. Her collar is wrong. In the 1963 Associated Press book titled The Torch Is Passed, we find these two photos, but again, each one disproves the other. In the first photo, the car has 2 rows and Conley is in the back seat with the Kennedys. In the second, the car has 3 rows and Conley is in with his wife in the second row, as expected. Also, the seats and the trim in the first photo do not match the car in the second photo. In the first, the back seat is fancier with some sort of metallic trim on split seats. We do not see that in the second photo. In the first photo, the door trim is straight with no dip. In the second, we see the dip between second row and third. The door locks don't even match. I will be told one photo is from Fort Worth and the other is from Dallas, but Jackie has the same outfit on. Do you think someone like her is going to wear the same thing in Dallas she just wore in Fort Worth? That would be like the most popular girl in class wearing the same fancy dress 2 days in a row. It would also imply they had 2 different presidential limos for Fort Worth and Dallas. Although the cities are adjacent, here's another photo with major continuing problems. I noticed immediately that didn't look like JFK, so I looked more closely at the photo. The car doesn't match. Compare the car to the previous photo. First of all, the flag doesn't have gold trim in this one. Second, this car has no side view mirrors. It should have 2 on this side, but it has none. Here are the different pictures that we were just talking about. We notice that there's a mirror here, but there's no mirrors on this car down here. Just look at the different things. Pause as long as you need to. Third, the partial window in front of Conley isn't right. It is far too narrow and doesn't connect to the top bar in the same way. This one was fake to make you think we have photo evidence of the throat hit. Here's another obvious fake. Again, the first thing I noticed was the ridiculous fake Kennedy with no head wound. So I looked closer at the car. The car doesn't match. Compare it to the famous one. What to look at is the pattern on the back seat. In the second photo, the pattern is square. In the first one, the pattern is stripes. Turns out those photos are from a movie about Oswald, but since they don't tag them that way on Google search, most people will assume they are looking at photos from the actual event. The photos from the movie then act as proof of the event, you see? In fact, with more research, that is exactly what I found. Many websites are selling those images from later movies as being from Dallas in 1963. They are spinning them not only as proof of the event, but as part of the later manufactured story. Here's another problem. That's not from a later movie. Can you spot the problem here? The guy is front in the wrong guy. Is the wrong guy. In other photos, he is older and has gray hair. Conley also looks wrong here. His head is too small. Conley had a big head. Compare Conley's head to the head of the guy in front of him. It looks like someone shrunk Conley's head. And look how big his hand is. It could cover his entire face. See, if your hand can cover your entire face as one final piece of photo evidence for a movie set that day. Let us look at the so-called aftermath photo of Bill Newman and his family diving to the ground for safety. This is the worst piece of acting ever, I think. First of all, we have no evidence this was even taken on the 22nd. Z-Film is not back there on his perch, for one thing. Then we have dad and son both looking directly at not one, but two cameramen, one still and one video. Both cameramen are in black suits and don't appear to be concerned by the flying bullet at all. Actually, neither do dad and son. Dad is supposed to be covering son, protecting him from flying shrapnel, but son's head is still proactively out in the breeze, where the cameraman can see it beauty. Mom is several yards away, also unconcerned for son. She appears to be looking back at camera number 3, possibly wondering if her dress is wrinkled from behind. Notice that no one is running behind them, although in other photos of that time, we have lots of running people in that very area. In fact, if you are very observant, you can see 2 people sitting under a tree in the shade. Look under the no standing sign at the very edge of the photo. You have 2 people in red shirts, one wearing light trousers, the other wearing black sunglasses. Whoops, they forgot to trim that photo, I would say. Another problem is the video camera we can clearly see in the man's hand. That is no crappy Bell and Howell zoom matter. Here are 2 of the pictures we were talking about, but even I'm like saying, why are they filming the mom and the son and the dad on the ground? Wouldn't they be filming the president getting shot? So that's just weird to me too. I mean, they're all like centered on these people over to the actual event. I would be filming the event, and that is no small camera. As you can see, that's a high-end dollar camera, like a movie camera back in the day. That is a professional video camera like the TV stations use. It is also what the Hollywood filmmakers used at that time. This is supposed to be footage right after the shots in Dealey Plaza. But if that's the case, why do we now have to rely on Z-Film? Was this guy in the black suit filming his shoe top split seconds earlier when the motorcade passed? For that matter, why does he find his uninjured family on the ground to be more important to history than the president who had just been shot, and who would still be in the frame? This professional cameraman is only yards from where the motorcade just passed, on the same line as Z-Film. I don't want to see footage of fake family. I want to see footage of Kennedy. But as it's obvious, he had no footage of Kennedy since this whole aftermath photo is a setup. It is a press release photo, a poster for the movie, taken sometime later. It is done with such incredible lack of fitness or foregrowth or direction that I doubt it was even done by the Kennedy movie people at all. It was probably hired out long after the fact. After all the professional people had gone back to Hollywood to fill some gap that somebody decided needed to be filled, my guess is that if Kennedy didn't kill someone in faking his death, he may have killed the someone responsible for releasing this groaner of a photo. Finally, given what I have shown you, we can now identify Umbrella Man. Umbrella Man is a mystery man on the curbside that day, said to be one of the unidentified people, the other being Babaska, the Babaska woman. He kept his umbrella open during the event, though it was not raining, and there was no threat of rain. Just before the shots were allegedly fired, he spun the umbrella once in the clockwise direction. After the cars had passed, he sat leisurely on the curb for a few minutes, then wandered over and went into the book depository building. This one is now so easy to figure out. Notice that he also has an assistant. The guy right in front of him is holding his hand up. They sit next to each other after the car has passed. Umbrella Man is the director, and the other guy is the assistant director. The assistant director is holding his hand up, which means and. The spinning umbrella means action. Together we get and action. Do you really think it was coincidence the umbrella spun once in a roll-em motion just a second before the action? Do you really think it's just a coincidence Umbrella Man is visible right in front of the car? No, he was positioned to deliver this very obvious signal, and we can now see it was just a signal to match the shots fired to the actors. Reaction. What about the Babuski lady? Study the photo closely and you will see that she was pasted in. How do I know? I looked at the size of her head compared to those around her. It is way too small, indicating she was inserted into the photo later. She is badly missized, showing a poor pace. The perspective is all wrong. But why paste her in there? Because they were trying to create a red herring. Here we see the Umbrella Man in the back, and and the Bascuti lady up front, clearly pasted into the picture. They wanted researchers to find her interesting and to waste time pursuing her. They are still using her for that purpose to this day, and thousands of Rahmaner websites are still promoting the mystery in photos that can't be explained. Links. Before we leave 1963 and move on, let us look at another curious death that year. The publisher of the Washington Post, Philip Graham, had supposedly killed himself just months before the assassination. His death has never been explained, nor has it quick fall into manic depression. Graham was a close friend of Kennedy and had partied with him sharing girls. One theory is that Graham was suicide for stating to blab about the women. It has been reported, too, that Graham told a group of reporters in Phoenix that Kennedy was sleeping with Mary Pinchot Meyer just months before he died. But this wouldn't have been news to anyone, since every reporter already knew that Kennedy was sleeping with everyone who would say yes. The press was already controlled, and Kennedy knew that. So this misstep through bad for Graham wouldn't have meant much to Kennedy. It wasn't worth killing him over. No, it was more likely that Graham was blabbing or threatening to blab about the big plan to take the presidency underground, which was now just months away. This would also explain Graham's mania. Agreeing to be conducted of official information and misinformation was one thing for a newspaper publisher. Covering up democratic and constitutional overthrows or subversions was another thing, and it is only surprising more people weren't driven mad by the knowledge. But the suicide of Graham was perfect timing for the Kennedys, since the murder of the second most prominent publisher in the country would assume the press silence and completely in the months and years to come. Plus, there is no reason to believe Graham was either murdered or killed. Like many others, he could have simply been relocated to South America, faking his death with small potatoes compared to all the other stuff going on. The same can be said for Marilyn Monroe. Although I won't have time to look at that here, I did more research on Philip Graham for my paper on the 2018 film The Post, discovering many new things. Now let us leave Dallas and look for later evidence. One rather obvious clue is that Johnson did not run for re-election in 1968. We are told he was shagged out from dealing with the press about the Vietnam War, but that is what it is to be president. Johnson had been dealing with that his whole life. If he hated the Kennedys so much, as we are told by the alternative theorists, why would he practically give the nomination to Bobby? The illogical one will say it is because he knew Bobby was going to be assassinated too. But that would imply that he was giving the presidency to Nixon. Also unlikely, I hope you admit. As long as we continue to accept the official story, Johnson's decision not to run remains an insoluble mystery. It doesn't make sense. But it doesn't make sense if Johnson was only a puppet. Johnson quit because he was tired of being the front man. In the beginning, he thought it would be great to live in the White House and be called President Johnson. But being a puppet loses its charm quickly, no matter where you get to live. When you have an underground king, the title of president loses much of its prestige. Johnson could have easily faked his death like the rest and lived his life out his ranch in central Texas. Yes, I said king. If we have no evidence that JFK was killed, we must assume he was not killed. If he was not killed, then he remained president. But once you take the presidency underground, you are not required to stop being president ever. At that point, the voting is for the puppet president, not the king. The Camelot comparisons takes on a whole new meaning in that case, do they not? Here's another strange piece of evidence, so far not explained or tied to any constant theory, is in 1964, a year after JFK's death, a woman named Mary Pinchot Meyer was allegedly murdered in an apparent hit in Georgetown in broad daylight. It turned out she was one of JFK's mistress, but no one knows more than that to this day. She has been married to Cord Meyer, one of the highest-ranking CIA agents in the country, and her diary was taken by the CIA under strange circumstances. The current theory is that she had been told something by JFK about his enemies. But if that is so, then these enemies would have killed her a year earlier. No, the fact that it is a year later is the biggest clue. It isn't what she knew about his enemies that put her in danger. It was what she knew about JFK. She knew he was still alive because he was still visiting her. That put her in danger in two ways. If JFK were sneaking out of his place of retreat in order to visit old girlfriends, that would put the entire underground government in danger. Jack's, allies, and backers couldn't have that. The best and often the only way to break an addiction is to get rid of the temptation. 2. Mary was now 44, which is a difficult age for a beautiful woman. Her beauty was probably fading fast, and it may be that Jack was tiring of her. In that kind of situation, a woman may begin playing dangerous games, even when national security is not involved. She may get desperate and start making threats. Mary may have found herself in a situation much like that of Mary Jo Capacha or Marilyn Monroe. After too many highballs or too much dope, she threatened to tell, and Kennedy couldn't take that risk. As for the diary, it had to be destroyed because of the dates in it. A reader would have been shocked to find that Mary was writing about meeting with Jack in 1964. This is why Tony and Ben Bradley agreed to give the diary to the CIA without reading it. If they had read it, they would have been in the same position Mary was in. They either didn't want to know or didn't want the CIA to know that they had already knew. Ignorance was their only hope. But again, within the line of my theory above, I am only assuming she was murdered, as we have seen. That it is a weak assumption. Jack may have just wanted her to join him underground, in which case she was relocated, not murdered. Or he may have wished to get rid of her, in which case she was relocated to South America somewhere. My best guess is that her death was fake like the rest. She simply joined her friends on Martha Vineyard. Before we finish with Jack, let us look at one last set of photos. Mike Riviero and many others have used these photos to put E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis on Daley Plaza that day, posing as bums. While I think it is likely that many of the people on hand that day were CIA or other employees of the government, and while I think it is possible Hunt and Sturgis were there, I think that evidence like this hurts any so-called investigation. Anyone with a keen eye can see that these bums are not Hunt or Sturgis. You couldn't trust my other photographer evidence if I fell for this one. I will show you what to look at once more. The Sturgis match is closer, since the eyes, the nose, the wavy hair, and even the ear matches, but it fails most clearly in the forehead. The tramp has a higher hairline than the nose. The wavy hair and even the ear match, but it fails most clearly in the forehead. The tramp has a higher hairline than Sturgis, and your hairline doesn't fall as you get older. Sturgis also has a much wider and more muscular neck, even if he put on a bit of weight. He isn't fat in either picture. You don't tend to put on muscular weight in your neck, but we need more than the face to decide, and the full body clinches the deal. Sturgis was never that tall. He had a short neck, which grows with a stockier, more compact frame, but the tramp is fairly tall and rangy with a longer neck. He looks more like Tim Robbins than Sturgis. I will agree, though, that he doesn't look like a tramp. He looks like a Harvard man pretending to be a tramp. Tramps don't have freshly washed hair like that, for one thing. As for Hunt, the resemblance isn't even close. The tramp in 1963 looks older than Hunt in 1972. The face is much longer and the tramp is jollier. The tramp has a longer nose too, mouth gap. His eyes are droopier in the corner and his eyebrows are higher. The tramp also looks to have quite a bit of hair in front, coming out from under the hat. The ear is also wrong. Hunt may have been there, but that isn't him. Riviera theories look to me like more misdirections. But let us move on. Once you are king, the only problem you have is dying before your time. It looks like Jack died prematurely in 1968 when he was only 51. Life underground is more difficult than you think. And Jackie gained weight and became depressed. His health had always been bad, and he was suffering from Addison's disease. Plus, he needed the attention and the spotlight, and being a secret ruler did not agree with him. Here are the pictures that we were talking about, comparing all of them. So Bobby was called to take his place. I mean, that was another thing. Why was everybody all fine with all the Kennedys that died? I mean, that is not coincidence, people. But the story plot thickens. It was time to fake his death too and give him his time on the throne. Now that you know my method, you can see that Bobby's assassination suffers from the same lack of hard evidence that Jack's does, and then some. When a person is really murdered, you have a body that can be identified and facts that can be investigated. But the Kennedys had learned from their mistakes in Dallas. This time with Bobby, we don't get any photos of the corpse or of the autopsy or of the murder that can be analyzed. We simply have to take their word for it. If they have hired some people to tell a story, we have to take that story on faith. since we have no analyzable evidence that Bobby or anyone else was killed. They show us some photos of holes in the wall, but no one at that time was allowed to do normal tests on those. We have nothing at all to go on, and surprise, the conspiracy theory once again theorizes everything but the obvious. They include their theories every suspicious person in the known universe, but never once mentions the possibility that Bobby faked his death for some reason. If you have no proof that someone was murdered, your first assumption should be that they were not murdered. If they were not murdered, then they must still be alive. Somehow, that never occurs to anyone. What we have been presented with in the way of hard evidence of the shooting is a few photos, like the famous photo of Borrachero, all of which are highly irregular. To start with, you can't make a positive ID. You can, however, make a negative ID, as I will show. All you can say is that someone who looks sort of like Bobby is lying on the ground. But beyond that, it is very strange that we have a boy posing with the fatality wound man and everyone else standing back. It is as if someone had said, "Oh, everyone, let's get the picture of the body so we can put it in the paper. Everyone stand back so I get a clear shot. You, young man, you look innocent and Catholic. Hop in there and put this rosary on him." That brings tears to everyone's eye. Even stranger is that we have a man who has just been shot. No one knows if he is dead. In fact, he isn't, according to the official story, but there is no hurry to carry him into an ambulance or have a doctor in the audience tend to him, or even to stanch his wounds with a kitchen knife. No. The first thing to do is, of course, bring in the photographer from Time to get a picture of him bleeding to death in the arms of a busboy. We don't call 911 before we get the picture. The picture is the most important, and Time was there? Wow. It would be tragic, except that this is not Bobby. Let's look at some of the secondary pictures to prove this. The last photo can be found in the archives of the Los Angeles Times. Where is the hand holding up his head? The cuff is empty. The head is pasted on. If you don't believe me, look at this photo from a few moments later. The part in his hair just switched sides. Beyond that, Bobby is wearing a white shirt with a white collar with many wounds, including wounds, we are told even now, in the head, neck, and chest. Gotta love pictures. Okay, here's some pictures that seriously, yeah. Just, yeah. I don't even know what to say. I'm just so glad I wasn't alive during this period, because my mouth probably would have landed me in jail for sure. Oh my gosh, this is sad. And yet a few more. How could this happen again so quickly? Another Kennedy. I mean, tragic. Tragic. He was allegedly shot 3 times by a man who approached him from the front. But there is no blood in any of these pictures. You can see for yourself that the busboy had tied a dark cloth around Bobby's neck, just above his tie and collar. Third photo. This prop can be seen in the Yarrow photo as well, lying off the side. It appears to be the extra necktie. Perhaps someone took off their tie to use as a tourniquet or wound dressing. This is supported by the shiny spot on the tie in picture 3, which is probably a tie clip or ornament. Miraculously, no blood has stained Bobby's collar, just below the wound, and the collar and the shirts are still pristine minutes later, in the other pictures where the collar is open. Oh, they should have got him a black sweater like they did Oswald. What the heck? What kind of neck wound from a bullet does not bleed? Maybe Bobby is saying to the busboy, "Forget the stupid cloth around my neck. A neck wound is not part of the scene here. That was my brother." As for the chest wound, it is possible we see a small spot of blood below his 3rd finger and in between the 3rd and 4th fingers. Some have said he is hiding most of the blood with his hand. They have said that in the photos with his shirt open, we see the wound clearly between his hands and above the rosary. I answer, we see nothing clearly, except some very anonymous things. We see one clear spot on another otherwise pristine white shirt, and that spot should have been added later in the darkroom. It should even be a button to match the dark button on his cuffs. There is no reason to assume he has white buttons on a white shirt. The reason we don't see the other buttons is that they are unbuttoned and beneath the cloth. In fact, it is right where one of the buttons should be, so nothing about it is clear. The darkness between his fingers could be a shadow that was dodged in the darkroom, or it could be something dark that Bobby is holding. And the open shirt photo is even less clear and more anonymous. That dark patch above the rosary is not clearly neither a wound or blood, but supposing it is less clear and more analogy, that dark patch, sorry, I'm repeating myself. That dark patch above the rosary is not clearly either a wound or blood, but supposedly it is a wound. It isn't even bleeding out. Though Bobby is still alive here, supposing it is blood, why is it not running? Why is it not on his hands or the rosary? Even more to the point, how did these people open Bobby's shirt without moving his hand? His hand is exactly the same place before and after as you see. And if there is a wound there, why are these people not attempting to stanch it? They are in a kitchen, we are told, and every kitchen I have been in has napkins in it. You don't need doctors or PhDs present to know that you snatch a wound, and you don't snatch it with a rosary. Stanch it. If you don't believe that these photos could have been manipulated in the darkroom, look again with me at photo 3, the largest one from the Los Angeles Times. We are still told that the fatal wound was the wound just behind his right ear. Since that bullet went into his brain, it is not clear how Sharon Charan managed to shoot him behind the ear while firing from in front of him. But here we have another wound that apparently failed to bleed, since the floor underneath him is not filled with blood. We see some light stains on the kitchen floor, but those don't look like pools of fresh blood. We should see blood clearly since we are on the right side. We are looking at the side the wound is supposed to be on, but we see nothing. This photo doesn't match the video footage either. What we do see is very, very strange. Look closely. Bobby's head is being held up by both the busboy and the man in the foreground, whose head we see, the man with the glasses. But the man with the glasses has had his left hand removed in the darkroom. We see the cuff of his sleeve, but no hand is coming out of it. He is holding up Bobby's head with a ghost hand. That whole area of the photo between the shoe and Bobby's head has been retouched. We have not only lost a hand, we have lost the real edge of Bobby's head and of his coat. None of that looks convincing. The retouchers have pretty much removed his right ear, but that was excess. The current story does not tell us that Bobby had his right ear shot off. We would remember something like that, as we remember Van Gogh's story. Compare his ear to his ear in the other photos. Bobby has ears that are prominent. They stick out. Look at the last photo especially. The left ear is sticking way out beyond his hair. What is more, we can see part of his right ear in photo 4. That bit of white beyond his face is his ear. Did he regrow that right ear while they were unbuttoning his shirt? Lest you claim that this photo 3 has been tampered with since 1968. Look at this photo of a newspaper from 1968. Same photo, same ghost hand. Finally, that photo is suspicious beyond any of lack of blood or retouching. The problem is that the head does not look like any of the other heads. Look at the hair. In the other 3 photos, the part is above the left eye, neither a center part nor a side part, but in between. In photo 3, the part is over the right edge of the right eye. Not even close to the other photos. In photo 3, the face looks like Bobby, but in the others, the resemblance is iffy. I say not even close to looking like him, but anyways, why is this, you ask? Because the head in photo 3 has been added later. That is why we have the extensive retouching to the right hand along the edge and into the lost hand. That is why the darks in the head don't match the darks in the rest of the photo. And that is also why the dark cloth was added. The transition from head to collar was poor, so they thought they would add this dark cloth. As you see, it still looks like his head is detached from his body. This is because the photo is pasted up. It isn't even a good paste up. Since they cropped out a hand in the process, making it look like Bobby is being held up by an empty cuff, they could have at least painted in a hook. Bobby always parted his hair on the right side, at the corner of his head, a true side part. Jack always parted his hair on the left. And I don't part my hair at all. Oh, wait. Yeah, I do. I part it on the left. Okay, yeah. Leslie parts her hair on the left, if anyone cares. Didn't think so. Quick, call a doctor. I lost my hand. My hand. Where's my hand? I have no hand. It's kind of creepy. Just saying. And I love his face expression. I'm sorry, but... Okay, I'm done. I'm done. If you if you see a painting or photo of Bobby with a part on the left, it is reversed imagery, or was painted from a reversed image. The web contains many reversed images. This is how I know for certainty that these pictures 1, 2, and 4 are not Bobby. We have even more evidence. If we compare various prints of the Yahoro image, we find they don't match each other. Again, I had to use a small image because the website has been taken down recently. But even at this size, it is easy to see that the shadows don't match. Look beneath the busboy's foot. In the big photo above, there is a black shadow there, but not here. Or we can look at a further photo sent to me from the same moment. The problem there is that the photographer would have to be standing inside a wall unless they move Bobby. Look at the first large photo by Yarrow. Bobby is lying right next to a wall. His hand is about 6 inches from the baseboard. So where is this last picture taken from? Not only is the photographer too far right, there is someone to his right. See the hand? That guy has to be standing to the right of the photographer or he would be in the frame. Is that guy another ghost guy who can stand inside a wall? And still more problems. These two photos don't match again. The parts in the hair don't match at all. Of course, we have video of Bobby speaking just moments earlier. Why hasn't anyone compared the photos? Not even close. Again, just study the part in the hair. And here they got way too cute, putting a campaign hat in the pool of fake blood. Really? No one thought that was just a tad over dramatic? This photo is also a terrible fake. I have never seen a more obvious paste-up. Just look at the various heads in the background. It is like some school kid cut these heads out of the paper and pasted them in a willy-nilly with no concern with whether the heads were the right size. There is absolute no depth of field there, no contestant's perspective, no sensible shadowing, and all the lines between heads are false. The worst is the line between the guy in the bow tie and the guy behind him. An absolute disaster. These aren't real people standing in front of one another. They are photos pasted together. Some will say, yes, these photos are fishy, but we have moving footage just after the shots as well, and audio, and many eyewitnesses. Are you claiming all of this was faked? Yes, clearly I am. This was another Hollywood production by the Masters of Manipulation. It was all staged. Joseph Kennedy owned RKO Studio for many years, and the Kennedys knew how to make movies. Don't you find it suspicious that there would be stage lights and movie cameras positioned in a hotel kitchen? Don't you find it suspicious that the moving film shows chaos with people filing the kitchen, while Yahoo photography shows dead calm and a single busboy at his side? As with JFK, we have several takes mixed together. Previous footage and retouched photos are being used, as well as footage from the stage play. We can't go on with suspicious minds. Okay, that was a bad Elvis, but all right, moving on. Here are some of those photos, as we can see. The pasties of the heads is really cute. I like that one. But yeah. They're not quite lining up quite right, but there you go. And this main and stage play was so well staged that it fooled most of those present. Those kept out of the center, John Pilger, for example, still believes RFK was killed, although he was there. He believes there were other shooters than Saran, but other than that, he was fooled. He heard a lot of shots, saw scuffles, and witnessed pandemonium. Who can tell the difference between blank being fired and a real .22 being fired in an echoing kitchen? No one. That is why they used a .22. If Pilger had happened to be a gun expert, for instance, he might have been able to tell the difference between a blank and a large caliber handgun, but not a .22. None but that those at the very center could have known it was staged, and those at the very center were actors. They were in on it, so all eyewitness testimony is meaningless. Only those near the center could give reliable testimony, and they were all paid to lie. This scene could have been staged with only about 20 people in the know, enough to act out the major parts and surround the action, keeping outsiders at a safe distance. Sharon, the ultimate patsy, had been hired to act in this movie, and he was trapped when he was sold as real. Once the trap sprung on, there was no escaping. He, with his lawyers, wasn't even allowed to plea as he wished. He was railroaded from start to finish. Either that, or he is another actor just pretending to be in jail. You may find that idea even stranger than everything else here, but it is actually the most likely. If they can fake all these deaths, don't you think they can fake someone in jail? See my paper on Charles Manson, where I prove they have done just that. Apparently, there were other pictures taken by people not paid off by the Kennedys, but these photos have been mysteriously vanished. Of course, we must assume it because they got too close and we could see that the man was not Bobby, or that it was Bobby Scott in art snapped off several rolls of film in the kitchen. But his photos were stolen by the city attorney in 1968. In 1995, his negatives were found in the California State Archives, and a courier was sent to Enyart to return to him. Surprised, the courier was robbed under mysterious circumstances, and the negatives are gone again. In 1978, 10 years later, we got courteous of Dr. Humes and Ida Doc's drawings of the RFK, autopsy photos, and x-rays. Drawings? You can't make an ID from either of these things, so we just have the constatation of a joke. Once again, we have to take their word for it, which is not proof by any standard. We have nothing but more very suspicious testimony from very unreliable sources. If the autopsy photos are of Bobby, why not show them? They showed us JFK's, so why not RFK's? Drawings from photos are absurd. Continuation of a disinformation campaign. This would also explain and excuse to some degree the complicity of Roffer Johnson and Rosie Greer and all the rest. Seems like in every staged event there's always these nice inconvenience mishaps that always seem to happen. You know, like no cameras working on a certain date in 2001 in airports. I mean, that was like nothing suspicious. All these insiders are guilty of lying, but not of lying about a murder. They are not covering up a murder. They are covering up the disappearance of someone who chose to disappear. A much smaller crime, if a crime at all. With all this in mind, you may wish to reconsider all the alternate theories of RFK's alleged death. Many are still pushing the alternative theory that Saran was a maturist candidate programmed to kill. We also have new evidence of 13 shots fired when Sharon's gun only contained 8. You see how they misdirect you into new controversies, but all the controversies, old and new, still contain the same final story. Bobby was killed. They don't really care if you believe there was a conspiracy or not. They only care that you accept the ending. They are quite happy that these controversies are still aired, since the controversies act to cover the truth. If you are thinking about a number of shots or Manchurist candidates, you are not thinking about how the photos were faked and about how we have no proof of the murder to start with. The government can certainly create hypnotic murders, but it has no need to in cases like this when no one is murdered. You don't need a hypnotic murderer. As Jack was the real power behind Lyndon, Bobby was the real power behind Dick. At that time, Nixon couldn't have won any election he wasn't given, and the 1968 election was a gift from the Kennedys. Doubters will say, why didn't the Kennedys make Humphrey their front man instead of Nixon? The Kennedys hated Nixon. One, there is no evidence the Kennedys hated Nixon. They wanted to beat him in 1960, but that is not hatred, that is ambition. Nixon was a better man to do their dirty work in 1968. They wanted to continue the Vietnam War, and Nixon was a better scapegoat for this than Humphrey. It was easy to sell the idea that RFK wasn't against the war and Nixon was for it. Although this was false, the Kennedys were never against the war. They used the Cold War and Vietnam War just like Bush and Cheney are using a certain date as the war in the Middle East. These wars drove the military, intelligent, economic, and made them and their friends richer. It was time for the Republicans to get the presidency. People assume that the Republican and Democrats are adversaries, but they aren't. They are allies. Some people are beginning to accept this, clued in first by Ralph Nader in the late 1990s, and now clued in by the total capitulation of the Democratic Congress to the neocon agenda, including the loss of habeas corpus, the shredding of the Constitution, and impending martial law. But it didn't just happen in the 90s or after a certain date. It has been true throughout the 20th century. Did FDR overthrow the Federal Reserve and turn the entire government on its head? No. He continued the policies before him with only substantial changes, just like they always do, even up to today. He looked for the earliest possible entry into every war, as had his predator, Republican or Democrats, and even used tricks to enter them. See Pearl Harbor. Then we have Truman unnecessarily bombing Japan, and of course Eisenhower, the ex-general of the Army. We pretend that Eisenhower was warning Kennedy of the military-industrial complex with his famous speech, but that has been misread, just like Kennedy's speech. Eisenhower was not warning Kennedy or anyone else. He was misdirecting. The bankers happened to need some misdirection in 1960 with Kennedy coming in, and they preferred that your eyes be on the Pentagon rather than on Wall Street or the Federal Reserve. He also needed to keep your eyes off the CIA. Why say military-industrial complex when CIA is much shorter? The CIA has already taken over the U.S. government in the 1950s, and Eisenhower was fully aware of it. So that is how Eisenhower's quote should be read. We still get that kind of misdirection all the time. The Pentagon is perfectly willing to play the part of the decoy, since that is one of its central roles. It is just a tool of power, but most people forget that. It isn't the military that is the danger. It is the people that are controlling the military that are the danger. If we look at Nixon's presidency, we find many more clues. Remember when Nixon ordered the FBI to back off investigating Watergate, and specifically White House tapes and correspondence? He said they should do so because of the Bay of Pigs thing. That quote is taken straight from their Wikipedia page, so it is no obscure quote. It is published there, despite the fact that Nixon's page at Wikia is a whitewash. No one has yet analyzed that quote in the correct way. You should see that Bay of Pigs thing is shorthand for Kennedy. That is a code word for Kennedy. Nixon is telling the CIA and FBI that he should not be investigated, since any investigation would jeopardize the Kennedy cover-up. It may be a threat to squeal, or it may be simply a warning that the White House correspondence is not clear of reference to the big secret. Another important letter confirms this reading. The letter from James McCoy to Richard Helms, revealed in Watergate hearings, says, Nixon and his boys pushed us to the brink, but they're backing away now and the danger is past. Every tree in the forest in the last 10 years would have fallen and the earth scorched. No one has ever been able to make sense of that letter. What you should notice is the 10 years part of the quote. The letter was written in 1973, so 10 years would take us back to 1963. Again, Nixon and his boys were threatening to squeal about the fake assassination, which would indeed have scorched the earth. We can only imagine that the CIA either threatened Nixon with a real gun or convinced him this would bring down the whole republic. Relying on his patriotism, I suspect the former. More suggestions of this included in the White House tapes that have come down to us. The famous 18.5-minute gap has never been explained, but it is clear that something was erased from that tape. That was more important than the evidence left on the tape, which was enough to impeach a president. Why would the tapes be saved and handed over to subpoena? Why wasn't the whole set of tapes erased or destroyed, as is now the common practice in the Bush administration? Once again, Nixon was the only fall guy. Someone more powerful than Nixon used the tapes against Nixon. That is the only reason we would have them now. But something on that tape did more than sacrifice Nixon. Nixon mentioned Kennedy as a living person on the tape, and that is why we still have 18.5 minutes of mystery there. Also ask yourself why Nixon would tape himself, leaving such obvious evidence. The answer, he didn't. Nixon wasn't taping himself. He was being taped by the Kennedys as a precaution. Nixon was being monitored from above, just as you are monitored from above at your workplace. Do we know of any previous president who had a complete set of tapes of their private conversations? Don't you think it's odd that Nixon would provide us with evidence of his own wrongdoing? Again, he was being monitored by the shadow government, and the tapes were meant to be a form of coercion. That is the only logical explanation for the existence of the tapes. Concerning Nixon, we must also remember that the Kennedys had a backup plan, one that they ended up using. That plan was Gerald Ford. If Nixon got uppity, they could just toss him in the bin and replace him with their lapdog, Ford. Remember that Ford was on the Warren Commission. He had been doing the Kennedys' bidding from the beginning, though from the Republican Party. People assumed that Ford was covering for someone else on the Warren Commission, but it wouldn't have been Johnson, and it wouldn't have been Nixon, since Nixon is one of the few major players who has not been tied strongly to the assassination. No, the turn of the screws here is that the Warren Commission was controlled by the Kennedys, by Jack Kennedy himself. Even Dulles was chosen to be on the Warren's commission by Jack himself. Why? Because in this way he achieved a final reconciliation with Dulles, who he now had further use for, and he defeated any last that the Kennedys were involved in anything in Washington. Furthermore, confirmation of all this is that Bobby Kennedy was still Attorney General in 1964. A lot of people forget that. Most people fail to study what Bobby did in 1964. If anyone thinks about it all, they tend to assume that he was scared to death and kept quiet from fear. That is an illogical assumption to make, since a man living in fear would not have immediately ran for Senate in 1964 and President in 1968. Bobby was not afraid of anything and never acted like he was for a moment. And yet he took no interest in the Warren Commission or any of the investigations. Since he was Attorney General at the time, this is the double and triply strange if you believe the standard or alternative models. A man who was capable of speaking out on civil rights, a man who was capable of planning covert operations, a man who was capable of running for president should have been capable of taking an interest in his brother's murder. It is obvious that he had the pulpit to do it, so like no else has ever had. The ovation given him at the 1964 convention was proof of that. If he needed it, but I don't think he needed it. He had nothing to say, and the reason he had nothing to say is that Jack was still alive. How do you investigate the murder of a man who is still alive? How do you quibble with a Warren Commission that was set up to blow fairy dust? You don't. You just dodge the issue. That is precisely what Bobby did. In the Boston Globe in 1998, Max Holland suggests that Bobby was suffering not from fear but from guilt. In an argument that reads like pure disinformation, probably written by the CIA itself, Holland tells us Bobby was guilty because the murderers had copied a plan that he himself had drawn up for murdering Castro. Holland promises us proof of that association, but never delivers it. Instead, bookending his one-line bald assertion with other bald assertions, he leads his argument by telling us that he got his idea from records, then being released by the Assassination Records Review Board. We are supposed to believe that this ARRB was going to make public every significant artifact and document related to November 22, 1963, and its aftermath. Over 4 million documents. This is so that reason may prevail over paranoia. What that has to do with Bobby's guilt, we are not sure, but Holland needed to get it in there somehow. Then we have the sentence about Bobby's guilt tied only to the title of the article, and then we move quickly into another story about Ford and Kissinger in 1975. When the CIA was in some hot water, Kissinger is quoted as saying that Bobby personally managed the Castro plot. That is because of this, the CIA is in fear for its existence. You will end up with CIA that doesn't only report and not operations, says Kissinger, according to Holland. Two things to point out here. One, Bobby was not in the CIA, so how does Bobby conduct whatever it was? Endanger the CIA? Two, the CIA was in no more danger in 1975 than it is now. Holland's entire article has been cooked up to rewrite history. It has nothing to do with Bobby's guilt and everything to do with convincing readers of the Globe that all assassination documents were released in 1998 and that the CIA was and is hanging by a shoestring for its existence in the cruel world. No, Bobby was not guilty any more than he was afraid. Bobby had nothing to say about the Warren Commission and almost nothing to say about the assassination because, of course, there was no assassination. Since 1963, the Democrats and Republicans have taken turn, almost like clockwork, pretending to run the country. We are told that this is due to the voters' tendency to throw the bums out, but the voters don't have any tendencies, since everything they do is either completely scripted or completely ignored. The real reason the two parties have switched every 8 years or so is that this is part of the deal. The parties don't care, they don't ask, and they don't tell. Not about kings and not about anything else, as long as they get a piece of the pie. This should now be clear. We can see that the parties and the major players in Congress and elsewhere don't care about any shadow government, not by the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the Federal Reserve, the CFR, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, or anything else. If they don't care about the shadow government, we know we have. Why should we be surprised to find that parties don't care about shadow governments? We don't know, we have. They aren't concerned about the CIA running amok. Why should we be surprised to find that they don't care about an underground king? Many were surprised that the Democrats did little or nothing to get rid of the computers after the computers stole 2 presidential elections from them in 2000 and 2004. But the Democrats had no interest in getting rid of computers or any other election stealing devices because the elections were rigged with the knowledge and coherence of the Democrats to start with. It wasn't their turn. 2, the Democrats looked forward to using the election stealing devices in 2008, which they did. You might also want to remind yourself what kind of president we have had since Nixon, Ford, the non-entry ruled by his Rockefeller Vice President Carter, the peanut butter farmer who came out of nowhere, Reagan the actor, Bush his snarling VP, and ex-CIA Director Clinton, the snake oil salesman from Arkansas, Bush Jr., the monkey in a suit. It was not coincidence that all of them were mainly actors. As Sting said in a song, they all look like a game show host to me. This was not true before Nixon. Why was it true after Nixon? It is because the presidency has by then become only a front. Johnson and Nixon had taken the part semi-serious. They had tried to slake their ambitions in an old-fashioned way, despite knowing that everything had changed. But after Nixon was taken down, the presidency was only an empty charade, and everyone knew that. It was an opportunity for sleeping with Ford, for grinning and shucking with Carter, for posing on horses with Reagan. After Reagan, the position became standardized. It was just a series of photo ops and canned teleprompter speakers, aboard aircraft carriers on ranches such as any circus barker could have done. Another thing that we might quote here is there was another actor from a TV show that was also hired as president recently, the Orange Guy. And another thing that's kind of crazy is, remember the Orange Guy told us that back in when he was running that he promised to lock up a certain evil witch? And then we all screamed, lock her up, and he told us he promised he would, and then, what? Wait, he becomes president, and he didn't lock her up. What? That's crazy. And then, of course, all your orange hair supporters will say, or orange hair people, or orange people supporters will say, oh, he didn't have the power to do that. Oh, yeah, but we have Mr. Pedophile Sniff Boy, who can pass anything and get anything passed, but supposedly he couldn't lock up one insane witch. No, they aren't on the same team. Just me being naive. How silly. Everyone knew that there must be someone behind this cardboard cutout, someone capable of making real decisions. Half-heartedly, we have thought to ourselves that maybe it was Hoover, Kissinger, Greenspan, or Cheney, as the case may be, but have never felt satisfied by this. In this void, the other conspiracy theories set themselves up, from secret commissions to the CF to alien oversight. How much more simple and rational is it now that we see the truth? Many of us had wanted a king, a Camelot, and we have been granted that wish. The Lady of the Lake came up from Hollywood carrying the sword escalator in the sheath of the Serenity, and the Kennedys retreated to the confines of Avalon, ruling us from beneath the waves with a sorcery worthy of Merlin. We know we have a shadowed government. Even the conspiracy theorists take Kennedy's own words for it, quoting him in 1,000 places. So how is it shocking to discover that the Kennedys were and still are the shadow government? What is most shocking, perhaps, is how obvious and logically this discovery actually is. A Congress that would accept a certain date false flag operation, military turbulence acts, Patriot Acts, Homeland Security Acts, named after a certain owns act, loss of corpse, and so on, would hardly stick at having a king, would they? Another fact that confirms this is that Clinton always leaned toward the conspiracy theory before he became president. He didn't believe the Warren Commission. Suddenly, once he's president, he changed his mind. Why? He was briefed. Once you actually meet a dead Kennedy, it's hard to maintain a conspiracy theory about his death. Once you get a call from the king, it is difficult to maintain his assassination. One way or another, Kromsky's recent comments fit in here as well. Why does Kromsky think the Kennedy assassinations are important? Why does he hold that there were no important policy changes from Kennedy to Johnson? First, he knows that Kennedy was not against the Vietnam War. Second, he knows that there was no policy change since there was no change. There was no Kennedy to Johnson. There was only Kennedy, and Kromsky knows this. But he cannot just come out and say it. The Kennedys have given him the freedom to say whatever else he wants to, since an intellectual's audience will never exceed 3% of the population. But he cannot tell what he knows about Kennedy. Still, the implication slips out occasionally when he belittles the JFK conspiracy theorists. Only someone who knew that Kennedy was never killed could dismiss the murder with such casual contempt. The same may also be true of Alexander Cockburn. Cockburn is not the sort to accept the Warren Commission. It is possible he has met some of the dead Kennedys, and so in an uncommon position on this topic, you also have to remember that Cockburn trashed Deborah Davis's book Catherine the Great in the Village Voice in 1979, probably the behest of the CIA. Do you need more? How about the fact that one of the little-known losses of that demolition is the loss of all the negatives of Kennedy's own photographer, Josh Lowe? The entire archives, or 40,000 frames, was lost at that certain place. According to the Lowe family, less than 400 of the frames had been printed in books and elsewhere. Not only that, but once again, they were lost under mysterious circumstances. The bank that owned the vaults at first claimed the safe was unrecoverable. They claimed to have spent $500,000 searching the rubble with no success. Suddenly, when lawsuits threatened to punish them severely for this lack of success, they somehow found the safe. $500,000 worth of searching couldn't find the safe, but the threat of a lawsuit could. Kind of same about those black boxes, too, huh? Typical. Chassai's daughter, Thomasina, has told the press that the safe was delivered in a highly suspicious condition, in that the number was simply chalked on the front of it. This number did not match the number she had in her records. The bank claimed it matched their own number, but did not show any paper to prove that. Then the New York Times reported that although the safe was burned but not terribly mangled, the door to the safe was open and there was no lock, only a round hole where the lock had been. Inside the safe there was debris. This last fact is the most important, although it seems to be the least important. Negatives are made out of plastic, and the sleeves would either be paper or plastic. If the lock had been knocked out by the weight of the crash from above, allowing fire into the safe, then the fire would have burned away everything. Fire does not leave debris. It leaves smoke or ashes. In the case of the plastic, it would have left a black film as a sort of solid puddle on the bottom of the safe. With 40,000 frames of plastic, we would expect a very large puddle indeed. But Thomason did not report ashes on any sort of plastic residue. She reported debris. Even if we imagine that the door may have been opened later by a weight from above, and that the debris from beyond the fire blew in that way, we would then have both debris and ashes. But we are supposed to believe that the debris got in and ashes got out, leaving a burned safe with no burned content. The space through which the debris entered was small enough to allow in only a small amount of debris, but large enough to allow all of the original contents to escape. None of the debris was recognizable as the remains of the negatives, or Thompson's would have been able to recognize that as a proof that this was the correct safe. In fact, a plastic residue from 40,000 negatives could not blown away or out of the safe, since it would be stuck to the ground of the safe's bottom. Go burn a small amount of plastic in a pan and then see if you can blow the residue out of the pan. No, you'll have to throw away the pan, since the plastic residue will have charred itself permanently into the bottom of the pan. That whole day I don't even want to talk about. My gosh. So many lies. Anyways. It is much more likely the debris was added later as a touch of reality by someone who was not highly trained in logic, or who did not know that negatives were made of plastic. Alternate theorists have used this new mystery to further bolster ideas that the Kennedys are still being targeted by masked men. But the Kennedys themselves would find these negatives more useful than any outside conspirator. We should also always most suspect those who have most to gain. Even without any mysteries or assassinations or fake deaths, the Kennedys would have the most use for pictures of themselves. And given whatever mystery in whatever form, the Kennedys would still have the most reason to want those negatives, especially if they contained some evidence that could be used to prove they were still alive. They would want these photos suppressed, just as they still suppress photos on the internet. As you have seen, there are few photos of the RFK assassination on the web. Most have been deleted. Am I through? Not even. JFK Jr. is said to have died in 1999. Let's look a bit closer at that date. Is it coincidence that all three Kennedy died on the eve of a presidential election? Jack died just before the 1964 election. Bobby just before the 1968 election, and John, baby John, just before the 2000 election. How old would Bobby have been in 1999 if he had lived? 74. That in itself is highly suggestive, since 1999 would be the expected time for a prince to come into power. And that is just what happened. I propose that Bobby Kennedy died in hiding in 1999. Even though that may have followed me this far, will block at imagining that John Jr. could be responsible for a certain date, and that the certain war and the Military Tribunals Act and the loss of Habeas Corpus and the Patriot Act and so on. But why balk at all that? His father was never who you thought he was. Listen again to the shadow government speech to the press. His uncle was never who you thought he was. He used all the civil rights stuff, just like Johnson did, to get votes and make you think he was a great guy. It didn't work with Johnson. Why did it work with Bobby? Ask yourself that. If Johnson had been better looking, you would still love him too. You wouldn't find excuses for him to. And baby was never who you thought he was. We are told that George Magazine was a professional journalism, but that is just hooey. It was a glossy, star-kissing piece of fluff with the required reactional politics. The truth is that baby was always just a dopey, rich, pretty boy who couldn't pass the bar and didn't know anything he wasn't told. He is now playing Commodus to his dad, Marcus Aurelius. To prove this, let us look once again at little baby's death. This time we have no photos and no film, but we do have a mass of anomalies and lies and impossibilities. We have a cover-up of something, and once again the most logical thing to assume, given the place and form and other players in the cover-up, is that the death was faked by the Kennedys themselves. I mean, alone, the fact that 3 die right before election, come on, people. Seriously? Okay, this ends part 2, and now it's time to go to part 3, and as you can see, we are starting to get into some juicy stuff. When we really find out how deep this rabbit hole goes, I told you, grab your popcorn. It's gonna get good.